Hello to everybody. My name is Matthew Cobham, and I'm responsible for lighting application at Philips Lighting. And I'd really like to welcome you to this webinar today, where we're going to talk about what we call the non-image forming role of light. And I'm really aware there may be people listening who have actually got a lot of knowledge about this, and some people who have no knowledge at all. So I'm going to try my very best to kind of bridge that gap as far as possible. This presentation was actually first shown at the Professional Lighting Designers Convention in Copenhagen last November. And I'm going to go through a slightly quicker version of what was actually showed there. It should take around 30 to 35 minutes. Okay, so how are we going to deal with this subject? Well, we're going to use this extraordinary image of the human retina taken by the researcher at Oxford University, Russell Foster, as a way to kind of map our way through the subject. Let's have a look at what we're going to cover. First of all, we're going to put the subject of the non-image forming role of light, or beyond being able to see, into a little bit of context. We're going to then look at some of the fundamental research, which is pretty important to understand a little bit of, to understand some of the background and then understand how this can actually be applied. And then we're going to really, ask that question, how can the circadian system be modeled in such a way that we can actually use it? We're going to look at how it's actually applied today. Then we're going to sort of begin to round off by asking, how can we actually take this further? But before that, I think it's worth making the point that this is now beginning to be, if you like, not a new subject, although it's only in roughly the last 15 years or so. A lot of fundamental research has been done, which has shown that we have a non-image forming way of receiving light, but of course, well before that, there are a lot of well-known designers who intrinsically kind of understood that light had a role way beyond what we can just see, if you like. And one of those designers was, of course, Le Corbusier, and an example of such a project was called Le Pavillon Electronique, which was a collaboration between Philips and Le Corbusier in the 1950s. And this is actually an original sketch by Le Corbusier, which a little bit illustrates his ideas there, which was all to create an exhibition, which was all about light and the senses, and it was a combination of light and music. And if you look on the internet, if you Google this, particularly, for example, on the title, the poem Electronique, you will find a lot of information. Let me just show you a very, very short clip to give you an idea of what this was about. So there's a lot of images, there's also something like you already know the role that light can play, for example, in certain what we call acute effects, one of the best known being seasonal affective disorder, very well documented, very well established effect, where people, if they're not getting the right quantity and right quality of light, can be affected by SAD syndrome. That's very well established. Other things such as alertness, which of course have a strong role to play, of course, in offices, in education, is also now very well documented in the role that light can play there. But nevertheless, the role of the non-image forming role of light is mainly applied in more kind of extreme working environments. No more so, perhaps, extreme hospital working environments, such as where we're dealing with Alzheimer's disease and delirium. And also, for example, here in very extreme working environments, such as in space. Here we have the well-known researcher George Brainard giving a talk about his work with NASA, where astronauts have their day concertinas into 90 minutes as they go around the world. Of course, what they're doing is actually very dangerous, and if fatigue becomes too much, then the whole situation becomes even more dangerous. So there is a strong role that light can play here to help those astronauts get the right quality of sleep. Now, let's just look very shortly at some of the fundamental research which underpins this, and then the subject will begin to form for you, everybody. Let's put things into a little bit of context by looking at this image of kind of cross-section through the brain, with the eye, of course, at the front here, and there where images are formed in what's called the visual cortex at the rear area of the brain. Now, there are two main pathways from the human retina. One goes to the visual cortex, so that's how images are formed. So if you're fortunate enough to be able to see well, that's how you're able to see things. And there is now well established since the end of the 1990s a second pathway going from the so-called third receptor, or the melanopsin third receptor, again from the retina, going to the pineal gland. Going to the SCN, which then influences the pineal gland, and it's the pineal gland which secretes melatonin. And melatonin is used in research as one of the key markers to determine what we call our circadian system. It's actually often called the hormone of darkness. It's what helps make you go to sleep. So that's a very sort of simplified view of the eye-brain system. Now, the point is that everybody is different. And Till Roenberg at the University of Munich very nicely summed this up into characterizing people into two types. One, early chronotypes, one people who wake up early, and he's called them larks. And the second type, as you might expect, are owls, people who stay up late. And the point is that this can actually change, of course, with age. So the classic example is teenage children who are, wake up later on in the morning. They're typically characterized more as owls. So that's the first thing to understand, that everybody is different, and also that changes with age. Now, when you look at the research, there are several key areas which are worth understanding a little bit about. First is research that's being done into the quantity of light. If you like some cornerstone work around there, if you want to look at more of this on the internet, around Zeitzer and team in 2000 who published a paper showing that melatonin can be suppressed where the quantity of light, or illuminance, is increased, and that kind of is shown quite clearly on the right graph here. That's one area of research, and the second area is about spectrum. Now, most of the way that we kind of quantify the visual role of light is all around what we call the V-lambda curve, which is symbolized here. The peak part of the V-lambda curve. It'd be worth you Googling a bit more information about that if you don't know about that already. It's in the central area of 555 nanometers. It's been characterized in other ways, other types of vision, mesopic vision, scotopic vision, and there are others as well. And the point is, though, we are only in the process today of characterizing the so-called third receptor. So these types of vision here, photopic vision, deal with the rods and the cones, which of course are the way you visually perceive light. But the non-image forming role of light hasn't sort of been, in terms of recommendations, lighting recommendations, hasn't yet been characterized. But it's generally agreed that around the 480 nanometer area, so if you like, in the blue end of the spectrum, is where you also have a sensitivity curve. So quantitative light and spectrum are two key areas. We'll come back to that. Now, if it was only quantitative light and spectrum, it'd be relatively simple. But actually, there are of course a lot of other things that influence it, and there's an interesting paper if you look on the internet by Ray and Figaro, published in 2011, which also makes reference to other things which influence it. So when you put together everything there, you then come to obviously a very, very complicated model indeed. And then if you add on to that age, then you end up with something that is certainly, unless you do it in computer modeling, is almost impossible to characterize. So here this shows different age groups you can see here, and you can see how the blue part of the spectrum, so these are the shorter wavelengths here, around the sort of 480, 460, 480 nanometers, how less of that light is getting through the older you are. So here if we take the purple or sort of pink color here, you can see that less of the blue light in this part of the spectrum is getting through into the eye brain system the older you are. So what does that actually mean? Here's a slightly sort of vaguely amusing example that older people, for example, because they can't perceive blue so well, very often overcompensate for it. For example, older ladies with using too much blue dye, for example. Okay, so we just had a look at a couple of the kind of key things around fundamental research. So the point is then, how can the circadian system be modeled in such a way that we can use it? Not an easy question to answer. There have been a number of attempts, which we'll mention in a second. But if you look at the current recommendations, lighting recommendations for workplaces, you don't get much help. There is no reference in there at all to the non-image forming role of light. However, last year in April, there was for the first time a DIN standard, a German DIN standard published, which does make reference to it. So we're beginning to get to a situation where tools are there, if you like, lighting designers and people working with light to actually work with the non-image forming role of light. First of all, this recommendation gives an explanation of the circadian system. Already that's a start. It makes the very valid point that illuminance is not the only solution, because you'll see that a lot. Sometimes people talking about just an increase in illuminance will actually mean you can actually influence the circadian system. Well, that just is not the case. There are a lot of other factors, as we've already established when I showed you some of the fundamental research. It gives a very sort of general, typical recommendation. We won't go into the detail here, and it gives some examples of where applicable. For example, in schools, night shift work, that's a very clear application then. Now, there's also a lot of work going on in various international technical committees to the idea being to actually make this possible and accessible for your specifiers in terms of lighting designers, engineers on a broader scale. So the CIE are working on this in various different methods. This is a group that I'm involved in around the appropriate light for older people and people with visual impairment. And when you consider what visual impairment actually means, then that potentially includes a large percentage of the population, as well as various regional technical committees such as this is the European Technical Committee, and actually very recently in Trends in Neuroscience there was an article published called Measuring and Using Light in the Melanopsin Age, and this was published by certainly if you Google a lot of these names by really some of the leaders in this subject. And the whole point of this is that this, for the first time, really publicly characterized the sensitivity curve at that and the blue end of the spectrum, which we already mentioned. That's the 480, around the 480 nanometer area of the spectrum, and for the very first time gives us, if you like, a starting point from which the recommendations can be based, and then we can actually end up with some recommendations that people can actually use. So let's look though at how this is being applied today. So now we looked at some of the fundamental research, which can become in depth very, very fast. Let's look at how this can actually is being applied already today. One of the areas in well-known architects in the 19th century, such as Edward Robson, came up with some very useful rules of thumb, particularly linking to the role of daylight in schools. And some of his schools actually still exist, such as this one in North London, near Hampstead. Education, like a lot of other areas, has been through some ups and downs, and certainly in the 1960s, that was one of the kind of down periods where there were a lot of windowless classrooms were actually built. Now, they were built for other reasons. Was mainly to do with the conservation of heat, because double glazing hadn't really started at that time, and it also happened at a time when there was an increase in lighting technology, the fluorescent tube, at that time quite poor fluorescent lighting technology, but it quickly became clear that there was a problem. And there's a lot of research around this about the effect on students, none more so than Carmel and team in 1965, where they did a study where they took 500 14 and 15-year-olds who were in windowless classrooms, 500 students who were in classrooms with a lot of daylight, and you give them all a simple task. You ask them all to draw their kind of ideal image of a school. And interesting, also tragic results were that the students in the windowless classrooms drew their classrooms as having more windows than the students in the classrooms with lots of daylight, lots of windows. So work like that and others happily created a change. Let's bring things a little bit up to date, and I'm now going to share with you a research project that Phillips Research was involved in. There's a lot of references worth taking a look at, which demonstrate that if students are getting more sleep, and that, of course, that can help with their retention of information, clearly useful in education, so behavior, having appropriate behavior, as well as concentration. And that's the parameter that which was used actually in a piece of research published in 2012. And I'm going to share a little bit of the highlights from that work with you. The basic idea was to provide teachers with a way to kind of structure the day using light. So here we kind of represent that. This is not actually what was used in the research, but just to give you an idea, higher illuminance levels with a cooler color temperature in the morning, and perhaps late morning when you wanted a calmer period, maybe for reading, for example, lower luminance levels with a warm color temperature, with 4 very simple settings. Let's have a look at some of the results. First of all, there was a pilot study done. This was undertaken using what's called the D2 test. The D2 test has actually been used for long-distance lorry drivers as a way to measure levels of concentration, and has also been successfully applied in other types of research, including education. And you can see here in the pilot study that around a 20% increase in concentration levels was achieved with the improved lighting. Now, what's also worth noting is that then in the realized projects, there were 9 examples included in the study. You can see the locations there. There was a very nice correlation with the pilot study. Some less, some a lot more, but you can see there's a pretty nice average around the 17, 18, 19, 20% increase levels of concentration. That's one example. Now the other one, the other area where a lot of work is going on at the moment, and where we're now going to focus the rest of the presentation actually, is in healthcare. I should just perhaps come back to this. This is an image of Florence Nightingale during the Crimean War. She was very well known as a nurse looking after soldiers in appalling conditions, and she recognized, of course there's no scientific basis for this, but she reported that where she put soldiers nearer daylight, she observed that they appeared to heal quicker. And I'm going to share with you a study which was undertaken in Maastricht. This is a study actually from a few years back. There is now actually just about to be published a new study linked to this. This was a preliminary study at the Center for Medical Center in Maastricht. And the basic setup was that there was a control room, a sort of standard patient room. There was also a patient room with improved lighting, which we'll explain to you in a second. It was set up with an independent research agency. Of course, all the rooms were on the same floor, on the same side of the building, so it was set up in a statistically relevant way. And there were 3 key elements that we're going to look at the results of in a moment as well. First was to have an artificial daylight reference. You can see that here in the ceiling with this artificial skylight, with the possibility that the ambience of the room changed. And the second part was actually the possibility for patients to be able to control the ambience of the room. You can sort of see that a little bit here, from sort of a midday kind of scene to a sort of evening or early morning kind of scene. And the third element was actually that the patients were able to control, had some level of control themselves. And it's been shown that where you give patients level of control, which of course they can easily understand, that's pretty important, then you can reduce levels of anxiety. So let's have a look at some of the results. Firstly, sleep duration was measured. And here you can see that there's a significant increase in sleep duration. This was after over a 7-day period. I should say, kind of reason why doing studies in healthcare is interesting is because, well, of course, unfortunately for the patients, but fortunately from a research perspective, people are kind of stuck in the same place for significant periods of time. But it is easier to make the study in offices, for example. You know, it's still possible, but it can be more difficult because of modern practices of ways of working, people moving around, for example. So there was around sort of 35 minutes increase in sleep duration, which, if you've already got perturbed sleep, is really a significant increase in your quality of sleep in the hospital. And the second was this is not clinical depression, but it's used there was a test called a depression score, often used in hospitals, around mood. And here you can see that what this graph basically shows is that people become less depressed, basically. So here you can see this is an increase in depression. So that's why you have the higher graph here, and you have the better results here in the intervention group. So those are examples of how this has been applied today. Now,
the Bosch study is of extreme importance to understand the effects of lighting on ICU delirium. There have been other studies in the past, observational studies, that show the importance of lighting in reducing ICU delirium. But the intervention studies that followed were never able to find a statistical significant result. So using our model-based approach, we're able to conclude that the intervention used by these studies were not enough to produce the desirable result. And for the Ehrenbosch study, we're able to conclude that the intervention that they used is enough. So we simulated different schedules and were able to devise the optimum lighting strategies for the Ehrenbosch study. So this is the first study to use the most up-to-date knowledge on the impact of lighting on circadian physiology, and this is the importance of this study. Now, our model-based strategy allows then researchers to develop lighting strategies, simulate them beforehand, before going to a clinical trial, which is very expensive, and this accelerates the advanced discoveries in this area. Our model-based strategy is not only useful for this particular case, but given its flexibility, it can be applied to any other study that tries to investigate the impact of lighting on the circadian system.
Okay, so let's now look at how can we take this further. And I'm going to share a couple of ongoing studies with you. The first one is at Philips Research. Here we're actually looking into a research project where the question is being asked, does a blue sky view help patients in some way? And what you can see here is an artificial skylight, and from the point of view of the camera and also the point of view of the patient, what you see is blue. But in terms of working lights, are either for the patient to be able to read or for the nurse or doctor to be able to undertake their work, they get white light. And then the light is able to change appropriately, not necessarily in terms of the time of the day, but depending on what is actually appropriate for that patient. So we really come back to that point about having appropriate light, having the right light for people at the right times of, well, the day, if you like, for them. Now, let's then spend a little bit more time looking at an ongoing research project at the Ehrenbosch Hospital, also in the Netherlands. This is an intensive care unit there, an ICU unit, where delirium is often a problem. Now, delirium is often a problem in a lot of ICU units. First of all, what is it? Something that affects really a large percentage of patients in ICU, and particularly also if you're older. It's more likely to affect you. It's actually not something you want to have. The symptoms are very undesirable: delusions, hallucinations, orientation impairment. And certainly, if you look at that on the internet, you'll see some pretty unpleasant footage of people suffering from this. And it's well established that light, where used in the right way, can help alleviate some of the symptoms of delirium. So let's then hear from the lead researcher of this project, Dr. Andre Barroso, who's going to give us a little bit of an overview of this research study. Okay, so I'll go forward and then you can insert the actual film which I'll send you, okay? Yes. So then let's explain a little bit more about what Andre talked about. The first point is that if you look at the melatonin secretion of somebody who's non-delirious, you'd see kind of what you'd expect, which is at night, higher levels of melatonin, the famous hormone of darkness, and then during the daytime, lower levels of melatonin. That's, for somebody who is, well adapted to light and darkness, depending on where they are actually in the world at that time. then, if you look at somebody who is suffering from delirium, you can see in the days leading up to the onset of delirium, you get a very sort of erratic secretion of melatonin, and this is established in countless research studies. So this is one kind of key element of this research study. So using this kind of fact, or well-established and well kind of agreed upon point, adding into there also some structure as a starting point, as Andre mentioned, clinical research studies are very expensive. So here we started off with higher luminance levels for longer periods of time, modulated light, and then higher luminance levels for shorter periods of time. And then when you look at the results, you get sort of what you'd expect: more melatonin suppressed, where you have higher luminance levels for longer periods of time, and less suppression where you have less light for shorter periods of time. However, what's interesting is this second graph. Let's just go back to this one here, number 2, where you have higher levels of luminance, but for shorter periods of time, but you modulate it. And the point is, you're getting a lot of the effect of the higher levels of luminance for longer periods of time, but using less light. Now, we haven't even touched upon the whole subject of energy consumption yet at all, but that is one of the reasons this whole sort of subject area is often criticized, because people say, well, yeah, if you have higher levels of lighting for longer periods of time, of course, yeah, you're using more energy. Well, in principle, of course, that's right. The whole point about this is about having appropriate light at the appropriate time, and not necessarily overall consuming more energy. Now, what this is all leading to, as Andre mentioned in his short interview there, is a mathematical model, which not only can be applied in this single research study, but the hope is that it can then be applied more broadly, and perhaps be even used as the basis of some of those lighting recommendations that we mentioned earlier, and then people can use it on a more general basis. Now, we've covered a lot of information over the last about 35 minutes. The point is that everybody is different. We all need the light, good quality light at the right time of the day, and we all need darkness also at the right time of the day. And understanding that, modeling that, if you like, is the key thing, and not so easy to do. Bridging the gap between the world of research and the world of application is where increasing amounts of work are going on. And one of the people who has helped bridge that gap is a well-known lighting specialist called Peter Boyce, and I'd just like to finish off with a quotation from him from his book Human Factors in Lighting, which is really worth reading. Light is like fire, a good servant but a poor master. It behoves of anyone who is involved in the design and specification of lighting systems to be aware of the impacts of light on human health. So I'd like to thank you very much indeed for listening. My email address will be available, and also if you want to contact me via LinkedIn, I really hope we can continue this discussion. Thank you.